Early one summer morning in 2009, on the quiet shores of Ross's Point Beach in northwest Ireland, a father and son on a jog made a chilling discovery. It was the body of a middle-aged man laying motionless on the sand. The man had no identification whatsoever, no wallet, no papers, and even the labels in his clothing had been carefully cut out, leaving no clues to his identity. Irish authorities arrived and quickly realized they had a baffling mystery on their hands. In most cases, when an unidentified person is found deceased, police eventually find solid clues to figure out who they are and notify relatives. Not so for the man who called himself Peter Bergman. Detectives soon discovered that a few days earlier, on June 12th, this unknown individual had checked into a Sligo hotel under that alias. He paid in cash and listed a fake address in Vienna, Austria. He was described as being in his late 50s with short gray hair and a thick German accent, neatly dressed and very polite. In fact, showing identification was supposed to be part of the check-in process, but Peter Bergman looked like a polite, upstanding individual, so this just flat out didn't happen. Investigators later pieced together much of the man's final days in Sligo, using surveillance footage and witness statements. On Friday, June 12, 2009, the unidentified man arrived in Sligo by bus from Derry in Northern Ireland. He took a taxi from the station and checked into the Sligo City Hotel for a 3-night stay, paying up front in cash. Using his alias, he gave a false Vienna address and was not asked for identification. Hotel staff noted that he had a German accent and kept to himself. And as any Simpsons fan knows, no one who speaks German could be a bad man. So obviously, there was no reason to do their due diligence. Over the next 3 days, Bergman maintained a low profile, but engaged in some curious behavior. Each day, hotel surveillance cameras caught him leaving with a purple plastic bag filled with unknown items, and returning with it empty. Investigators believe he was gradually dumping his personal belongings in trash bins all around Sligo, carefully using different locations to ensure nothing would be recovered. He seemed to deliberately avoid surveillance when disposing of things, suggesting a well-planned effort to erase his past. On Saturday, June 13th, he visited the local post office to purchase airmail stamps. It's presumed he mailed out letters, perhaps final messages to someone, but if so, those letters have never been traced by police. That weekend, he was occasionally seen stepping out for a smoke or a meal alone, always polite but extremely distant. On Sunday, June 14th, the man took a taxi to Ross's Point, the scenic beach outside town, where his life would soon end. He asked the driver for a good place to swim, and at the beach, he got out, looked around briefly, then oddly decided to head straight back to town in the same taxi. It was as if he was scouting the beach for what he planned to do next. Monday, June 15th, was the mysterious stranger's last day alive. Shortly after 1 p.m., he checked out of the hotel, carrying only a black shoulder bag, his purple plastic bag, and a new medium-sized black suitcase. The small carry-on bag he'd arrived with was no longer with him, implying he had disposed of it somewhere throughout his stay. From the hotel, he walked to the bus station, and there, he bought a coffee and a snack, and was observed reading some notes on small scraps of paper. He then tore them up and threw the pieces into a garbage bin. Whatever information he wrote down, he clearly didn't want anyone else to see it, and these scraps were unsurprisingly never recovered. That afternoon, the man boarded a bus to Ross's Point Beach once again. Several beachgoers later remembered seeing him walking along the sand that day, a tall, gray-haired man in a dark jacket, politely greeting passers-by. He didn't seem distressed, and if anything, it was the exact opposite, like he had found some sort of profound peace. Witnesses recalled him smiling and nodding hello as he strolled the shore, looking generally upbeat. As evening fell and the beach emptied, he was last seen alive at approximately midnight, still alone by the water's edge. By the following dawn, the man only known as Peter Bergman was no longer amongst the realm of the living. At 6:45 a.m. on Tuesday, June 16, 2009, a local man and his son were jogging along Ross's Point when they found a body lying near the water's edge. It was the same stranger who had been seen around town, now deceased. He was dressed for a swim, wearing only beach attire, and some of his clothing was found on the shore, but there were no identification documents anywhere. Police noted that even the tags in his clothes had been cut out to conceal any origin clues. The man was officially pronounced dead at the scene, and the Irish police launched an intensive investigation to find out who he was and how he died. A post-mortem examination yielded more surprises. Despite his fit appearance in life, the man was in very poor health. He had advanced prostate cancer and multiple bone tumors, as well as signs of past heart problems. Yet, remarkably, toxicology tests found no trace of any medication in his system. He wasn't even taking painkillers, despite what must have been severe pain from his chronic conditions. As for his likely cause of death, it's not what you think, and I don't have to use some euphemism like unalived to talk about what happened next. The pathologist noted that there was no classic evidence of drowning in his lungs or airways. He had likely succumbed to cardiac arrest while entering into the cold sea or while on the shore of the beach. There were absolutely no signs of foul play or trauma. Investigators worked diligently to identify the dead man. They ran his fingerprints and DNA through international databases with no matches. They checked missing persons reports across Europe and beyond, but found nothing that fit his description. The address he had given at the hotel was as phony as his name, and after a 5-month investigation, authorities had the unknown man laid to rest in Sligo in an unmarked grave. In the end, the man who had gone to such pains to hide his identity succeeded, and he remained a mystery. Over the years, various theories have emerged to explain the enigma of Peter Bergman. Some are sensible, others quite far-fetched. The leading theory is that the man was terminally ill and chose to perish in a place where no one knew him. Knowing he didn't have long to live, he may have decided to slip away quietly, rather than letting his friends and family see his final painful days. The beautiful, secluded coast of Sligo could have seemed like a fitting spot for his final moments. In this scenario, every step he took, including disposing of his belongings and removing all labels, was to ensure that his death would leave no trail back to his past life. Perhaps he even hoped his body would drift out to sea and never be found, fully completing his disappearance. Another theory is that Peter Bergman was hiding from something or someone. The use of an alias, the deliberate erasing of his traces, and the secretive behavior suggest to some that he might have been a fugitive or a former spy trying to escape detection. This idea is, of course, extremely interesting, but there's just really nothing to suggest it whatsoever beyond the fact that his behavior was unusual. Peter Bergman is no Isdal woman, and the circumstances seem to suggest that this cowboy wasn't running from anyone other than himself. Even more outlandish speculations have also been floated, reflecting how baffling this case is. Some amateur sleuths pointed out his careful tactics and wondered if he had a military or law enforcement background. One particularly bizarre claim even suggested the entire case was a hoax, orchestrated by a filmmaker as a piece of performance art. In truth, no evidence has ever emerged for any of these exotic theories. My personal theory is that the man who used the name Peter Bergman deliberately engineered his disappearance, but he didn't want to leave those he cared about uninformed. The sequence of documented actions feels like the work of someone conducting a tidy, intentional exit after a period of pain and suffering. Those measures show planning and a desire to control the manner in which he would be known or unknown. They read to me as deliberate acts meant to separate the public facts of his death from the private communications he still intended to make. If he did send letters, as the purchase of airmail stamps suggests, those envelopes would serve as his chosen mechanism for confidential contact. Airmail implies international destinations, and the possibility that he wanted to reach people who lived far away without creating an electronic trail. Mailing handwritten messages would let him speak directly to selected recipients while avoiding traceable phone calls, emails, or digital footprints. The simultaneous act of shredding or tearing other notes in public fits a pattern. He wanted certain words to travel and everything else to be irretrievable. In short, he could have ensured that only those he trusted received explanation or farewell, while the wider world saw only a man with no identity. The puzzle of public silence, despite significant media coverage, becomes less mystifying on this reading. If the people who knew him had already been told and had agreed to honor his wishes, they might have chosen privacy over publicity. Thus, the absence of public identification doesn't necessarily mean no one knew him. It may actually mean the opposite, that those who knew him very well and chose to respect his wishes. On the afternoon of June 11th, 1980, a man climbed to the top of a coal pile in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, and found a body lying face up on the black stones. The man was middle-aged, dressed in a suit, and missing his shirt. His wallet and watch were gone, his wedding ring absent from his finger, and his hair had been cropped short in a way that didn't match how he'd looked a few days earlier. Strangest of all, despite having apparently spent some time lying on a slope of loose coal, roughly 10 to 12 feet high, there wasn't a smudge of coal dust on him anywhere. No black streaks on the pants, no dirt under the fingernails, no disturbance in the pile beneath him, as if he'd been placed on the summit by something that never actually touched the coal. The man on the pile was Zygmunt Adamski, a 56-year-old Polish-born miner who'd last been seen by his wife 5 days earlier, walking down the street to the local grocery store. The last thing anyone could say with any certainty was that he'd been in good health, sober, and on his way to pick up a few groceries before the family attended a wedding the next day. 5 days after that errand, 20 miles from where he'd last been spotted, he was gone. And let's just say some people think this isn't your usual true crime style abduction case. Many people believe that Adamski was abducted either by forces from outside this world or by shadowy intelligence agencies from the Eastern Bloc. Adamski was born in Poland in August of 1923 and came to Britain in the 1940s, where he eventually built a life for himself in the mining country of West Yorkshire. Britain took in a large population of Polish servicemen and civilians who'd ended up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain when the fighting stopped. Many of them, despite having fought for their country, had no realistic prospect of returning to their homeland without facing persecution. By 1980, Adamski was living with his wife Lottie at a modest house on Thornfield Crescent in Tingley, a small village sandwiched between Leeds and Wakefield. She'd been suffering from multiple sclerosis for years by that point, which meant Adamski's domestic life was organized around her care as much as around his own routine. He was, by every account that survives, unremarkable in the best possible sense. Friends called him Ziggy, and neighbors described him as steady, polite, and fond of tending his garden. He and Lottie had been married for decades, and although the couple didn't have children of their own, Adamski was close to his extended family. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, Adamski told Lottie he was going to shop for potatoes, which tracks because honestly, Polish people absolutely love their potatoes. He put on a jacket, stepped through the front door sometime around 3:30, and turned onto the road that led into the village. According to accounts, he stopped briefly on the way to greet a neighbor, exchanged a few words, and carried on walking. That was the last confirmed sighting anyone would have of him. He didn't come back that evening. By nightfall, Lottie was pacing the house, and by the time the hour grew late, she'd called the police. Her initial fear wasn't illness or confusion or an accident on the road. She reportedly told officers that she suspected he'd been abducted. Why she jumped to that conclusion so quickly has never been fully explained in the public record, but it's worth sitting with for a moment. A woman whose husband had lived in Britain for decades, in a quiet village where nothing much ever happened, immediately assumed the worst possible scenario. Whatever she knew about her husband, or feared about the world he moved through, she wasn't treating this as a case of a middle-aged man wandering off to clear his head. West Yorkshire police opened an investigation, but they came up with absolutely nothing. For 4 full days, Adamski had effectively stepped off the edge of the map. On June 11th, 5 days after Adamski walked out for those potatoes, a man named Trevor Parker climbed up a pile of coal at his father's yard near the train station in Todmorden. Todmorden sits in the Calder Valley on the border between Yorkshire and Lancashire, about 20 miles west of Tingley. It's a mill town tucked between steep green hills, notable for very little in 1980, except that within months it would become one of the most heavily documented UFO hotspots in British history. But on that particular afternoon, in the fading warmth of early June, Parker was just doing his job. Shortly before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he spotted something on the peak of the pile that didn't belong. When he got close enough to make out what he was looking at, he found Adamski, his eyes open and his face set in what witnesses at the scene would later describe as an expression of terror. Parker called the police, and a constable named Alan Godfrey arrived and became the first officer to examine the body. And trust me, you're going to want to remember this officer's name, because he'll play a big role in the more unusual developments in this case. What Constable Godfrey found was a body laying on the loose coal near the top of the heap, and simply put, nothing about the scene made rational sense. The pile sloped sharply on all sides, the kind of surface a living person can't climb without shifting the stones and leaving tracks behind them. But there were no tracks, and there were no scuffs in the coal. There were no footprints leading up or down, no sign of any person or vehicle having approached the pile recently, and no disturbance in the material beneath or around the body. Adamski hadn't climbed up under his own power, and nobody had carried him up there in any ordinary way that left an ordinary mark. The details didn't stop being strange once the body was moved to the mortuary. Adamski was wearing the suit he'd left home in, but his shirt was gone. His wallet, his watch, and his wedding ring were all missing. His shoes were tied correctly, but his pants and jacket were fastened wrong, as though someone unfamiliar with his particular clothing had dressed him again in a hurry. His hair, which had been worn longer when he'd left home, had been cut short and roughly, as if someone had taken a pair of blunt shears to it and hadn't cared how the result looked. Despite having been missing for 5 days, he'd only grown about 1 day's worth of stubble, suggesting he or someone else had shaved his face. His skin was largely clean, and there was no coal dust on him anywhere. Not on the suit, not in his hair, not under his nails. Adamski had a series of burn marks across the back of his neck and the tops of his shoulders, with smaller marks on his head. The burns didn't look fresh, and a forensic examination estimated that they were roughly 48 hours old at the time of death. This means whatever process caused them had happened a full 2 days before he ended up in the yard. Covering those burns was a substance no one could identify, a greasy ointment or gel that had been spread across the wounds in a way that strongly suggested someone had tried to treat them. Samples of the ointment were sent to the Home Office forensic laboratory, but the results came back inconclusive. The substance didn't match any standard burn treatment available in a pharmacy, any industrial chemical the lab had on file, or any common household preparation anyone could think of. The post-mortem was carried out by Dr. Alan Edwards, a pathologist at the Royal Halifax Infirmary. Edwards determined that Adamski had perished sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon on June 11th. This placed his death within hours of the body being found on the heap, and the official medical cause was listed as a heart attack. There was no trauma consistent with a beating, no wounds that could account for his sudden passing, and no signs of starvation or dehydration during those missing days. The inquest was presided over by the West Yorkshire coroner James Turnbull. Turnbull took the case seriously, and he heard from the pathologist, from Constable Godfrey, from Lottie Adamski, from the coal yard staff, and from forensic experts who'd examined him. After several months of deliberation, he returned an open verdict, which was essentially a formal acknowledgement that while he died from a heart attack, the circumstances were unexplained. Turnbull would later tell journalists that the Adamski case was the single strangest matter he'd encountered in his career. He said the question of where the man had been during those 5 days, and what had been done to him while he was missing, was a question he simply couldn't answer with any confidence. The case might have faded into the footnotes of British missing persons history if it had ended at the inquest. But about 5 months after Adamski's body was found, the officer who'd examined him at the coal yard had an experience of his own that dragged the whole story into another dimension entirely. On the morning of November 28, 1980, Alan Godfrey was on duty in Todmorden, driving alone in a marked police vehicle shortly after 5 in the morning. He was reportedly looking for a small herd of cows that had been reported loose from a farm, the kind of errand rural officers in the north of England get pulled into on quiet shifts. What he said he saw instead was a large, diamond-shaped object hovering above Burnley Road ahead of him, rotating slowly, glowing, and sitting roughly 5 feet off the road. He initially thought it was a bus, but when he got closer, he realized the object didn't have wheels. Godfrey attempted to radio in the sighting, but his car radio and his personal handset both failed. He reached for his clipboard to sketch the object, and according to his own account, the next thing he was aware of was driving his vehicle further down the road. He had absolutely no memory of how he'd traveled that stretch, nor what period of time had passed. Estimates taken later placed the gap at somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, and Godfrey himself sometimes described it as longer still. In fact, it wasn't until he was back at the station that he realized he'd returned much later than he should have. To make matters more bizarre, a driver on the same road roughly 3 miles further on reported seeing a bright white object at a time that matched his. When officers returned to the spot where the object had hovered, they found an oddly dried, swirled patch of roadway in an area that was otherwise soaked with rain. The cows Godfrey had been looking for turned up at sunrise in a rain-drenched field, allegedly with no hoofprints in the mud to explain how they'd got there. Godfrey's police-issue boots, sturdy service-grade leather, were split along the soles as if he'd been dragged across something rough. Under hypnosis arranged later as part of an independent investigation into the incident, he reportedly described being taken into a strange room. There, he reportedly encountered a tall, bearded figure alongside several small, mechanical-looking beings he compared to robots. There was no physical evidence to confirm any of it beyond the marks already noted, and a faint red mark that appeared on his foot. Godfrey has stood by his account consistently in the decades since, giving interviews on television, on the radio, and in print. The press coverage damaged his career significantly, and by 1981, he'd been pushed out of the West Yorkshire Police on grounds officially unrelated to the sighting itself. However, it was generally understood that his colleagues expressed concern that he had become a liability in light of this bizarre incident. He's maintained ever since that he saw what he saw, that something happened to him that morning that he can't explain. According to some theorists, this suggests that Adamski was also abducted in a similar way, though he wasn't so lucky. 4 broad explanations have circulated about Adamski's death since 1980, and none of them accounts for every detail on the table. The first is an extraterrestrial abduction, which is the theory that made the case internationally famous. Its supporters point to the absence of cold disturbance around the body, the unidentified ointment, and the unusual burns. They also note his sloppily cut hair, the missing beard growth, and the fact that Godfrey had his own apparent encounter less than half a mile from the coal yard. The second theory is far more grounded and far more mundane, suggesting foul play by a group of local men. Under this version, Adamski was grabbed shortly after leaving home and held somewhere for several days. During this time, he was subjected to some form of assault that left him burned. He was then treated with whatever was on hand, but when his captors realized he was dying, he was then dumped. The problem with this theory is the absence of any suspects, any confessions, any witnesses, or any forensic link to a specific location. There's also been no indication of any motive in the decades since all indications are that amongst the locals, he was well liked. The third explanation is a theory involving Eastern Bloc intelligence, and personally it's the one that I prefer. Adamski was Polish, and Poland in June 1980 was a country on the edge of the Solidarity uprising that would detonate weeks later. A handful of writers have speculated that he had information, contacts, or a past that made him of interest to the KGB or its allied services. They believe that his body was left as a message or as the result of a botched interrogation. That said, there's no evidence Adamski had any political involvement of that kind, and no declassified documentation has ever emerged to support it. However, the area had many Poles who very specifically didn't return to communist Poland and were actively interested in breaking the Soviet yoke. My personal speculative theory is that Eastern Bloc agents may have mistook Adamski for someone who was politically active and abducted him. Under this theory, I believe he may have suffered from a heart attack during the interrogation, and the agents then dumped his body in a manner that looked intentionally mysterious. This would provide some explanation of the unusual situation he was found in, and why the evidence didn't make any sense. The fourth theory, which surfaced in later decades after family conversations with independent investigators, points to a domestic dispute. According to accounts published years later, a relative of the Adamskis had been experiencing marital troubles. Under this theory, Adamski had tried to intervene on behalf of one of the parties, and he was abducted in an attempt to persuade him to forget about the whole situation. That said, this theory essentially has absolutely no evidence to back it up, and there's no confirmation that Adamski had inserted himself in any familial dispute. In the end, what survives of Zygmunt Adamski, more than 4 decades later, is a coroner's open verdict and the memory of a middle-aged miner who walked out one afternoon. While his case has become somewhat legendary for its connection with extraterrestrials, ultimately, this connection never would have happened without Godfrey's subsequent claims. In the end, I strongly suspect that foul play was involved, and I think the timing with the Solidarity uprisings in Poland is simply too convenient to be ignored. After all, the area where he lived was rich with anti-communist Polish exiles, the exact sort of people who may have been supporting the movement from abroad. While there's nothing to suggest this is what Adamski was doing, he may have known people involved in the movement, and this alone may have been enough for him to be targeted. The night of January 3rd, 1804, was cold, damp, and oppressively dark in the village of Hammersmith, then a small rural outpost on the western fringe of London. Its unlit passages, like the notorious Black Lion Lane, were narrow and enclosed by high hedges, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead even on a clear night. But this was not a clear night, and a mist crept up from the river, and a deeper, more chilling fog of fear had settled over the community for months. This was a named terror, a phantom that stalked the churchyard and its surrounding lanes, a specter the locals called the Hammersmith Ghost. Just after 11 o'clock, a lone figure dressed entirely in white moved through the gloom of Black Lion Lane. From the shadows, another man emerged, armed to the teeth and potentially boozed to the hilt, ready to face this so-called ghost. He leveled his weapon and shouted a challenge into the darkness, and when he got no response, he started blasting. The shooter, a 29-year-old officer named Francis Smith, cautiously approached what he believed was the vanquished specter that had terrorized his neighbors. But instead of a pile of ectoplasm, he found warm, solid flesh. Instead of a shroud, he found the clean white work clothes of a local tradesman. The ghost was Thomas Millwood, a 22-year-old bricklayer, his white flannel waistcoat and linen trousers now rapidly staining red. In a single panicked moment, a ghost story had been brutally inverted. The hunt for a supernatural monster had ended in a very human tragedy, and the true horror was not the phantom, but the violence born from the fear of it. This event would pose a profound question to the English legal system, one it was utterly unprepared to answer. Can a man be guilty for slaying a ghost he genuinely believed was real? The tragedy that unfolded in Black Lion Lane was not the result of a single man's rash action, but the culmination of a perfect storm of social hysteria and cultural superstition. For 2 months, from November 1803, the community of Hammersmith had been gripped by a growing panic. The sightings began as whispers and escalated into terrifying tales. Witnesses gave inconsistent descriptions of the apparition, a common feature of collective delusion. Some saw a tall figure draped in a white burial shroud, while others reported a more monstrous creature wearing a calfskin hide, complete with horns and large, ghastly glass eyes. Basically, think of a minotaur-like monster, and you wouldn't be far off at all. Notably, this phantom wasn't just some passive observer. A local brewer later testified that the entity had leaped from behind a tombstone and seized him by the throat. Unsubstantiated but widely circulated rumors claimed that a pregnant woman had been slain by the ghost. Another story told of a wagon driver who, upon seeing the specter, abandoned his team of 8 horses and 16 passengers to flee in terror. These stories found fertile ground in the cultural soil of the early 19th century, a time when scientific rationalism hadn't yet displaced deep-seated folk traditions. The community quickly developed a backstory for their tormentor, and determined that he was a restless spirit of a man who did the deed to himself. According to prevailing religious doctrine, an individual such as this couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, as it was thought their soul would be unable to find eternal rest. This man, however, had been interred in the Hammersmith churchyard, so his malevolent presence was seen not just as a random haunting, but as a direct consequence of a spiritual transgression, and the entire community was going to pay for it. Compounding the cultural validation of this supernatural fear was a near-total absence of effective law enforcement. The year was 1804, a full 25 years before Home Secretary Robert Peel would establish London's first professional, centrally organized police force. In this pre-Peel era, maintaining order was a fragmented and often inadequate affair, reliant on a patchwork of elected parish constables and paid night watchmen. These men were poorly equipped and lacked the organization to handle a widespread public panic. To give you a sense of the lack of professionality and organization, some of these watchmen were partly paid in fringe benefits like access to alcohol while on the job. The night watchman on duty during the incident himself claimed to have chased the ghost on a previous night, only for it to escape by shooting off its white sheet into his face. And no, you don't have to rewind. This watchman thought a real ghost threw a white sheet at him to escape, like some sort of salamander losing its tail. If you're wondering who was watching the night watchman, it was basically nobody. His response to the crisis wasn't to call for organized backup, but to agree to join Francis Smith's insane, drunken posse of clowns. Notably, while Smith was an officer in the armed forces, he had no official capacity when it came to community policing whatsoever. On the night of January 3rd, two men's paths converged in Black Lion Lane, set on a collision course by a combination of unfortunate choices and the pervasive atmosphere of fear. Thomas Millwood, the young bricklayer, had the profound misfortune of resembling a ghost. His trade required him to wear clothes that were uniformly white: linen trousers, a flannel waistcoat, and an apron, all kept meticulously clean. In the pitch-black, unlit lanes of a village on high alert for a white-shrouded creature, this attire was a serious hazard. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Millwood had been repeatedly warned about the danger. His family and even his landlord had seen the risk and begged him to wear a dark greatcoat over his work clothes when he went out at night. He had actually already been mistaken for the ghost on at least 2 previous occasions, but he basically wrote off the risks of anything serious happening. Francis Smith, the 29-year-old officer, was by all accounts a respectable and mild-mannered man who was eager to play the role of the hero in this tale. Multiple witnesses at his trial would testify to his humane and kind character, and he cared a lot about his community. He took it upon himself to take a leadership role in the posse that was patrolling the streets for the ghost. Francis was scared of ghosts, as was the style at the time when virtually everyone believed them to be a real threat. Because of this, the local pub offered him a strong drink or two to steel his nerves while he was out there on his ghost-busting mission. After Francis Smith realized the gravity of what he had done, he immediately found help and confessed what happened to 2 men, one of whom was named John Locke. But not that famous John Locke, since he would have been around 170 years old at the time. After transporting the body of Thomas Millwood to the Black Lion Inn with the help of the men, he immediately and promptly surrendered to a local constable expressing remorse. When Francis Smith stood trial at the Old Bailey just over a week later, he wasn't judged by the standards of a terrified villager, but by the cold, rigid logic of 19th century English law. The case exposed a deep chasm between common-sense morality and the strict letter of legal doctrine. Smith was charged with having ended the life of Millwood willfully and pleaded not guilty, his defense resting on the claim that he had made an honest and tragic mistake. He had believed he was confronting a dangerous supernatural entity and was in a state of mortal terror. The jury was clearly moved by this argument. They heard extensive testimony about the widespread panic the ghost had caused, the violent nature of its reported attacks, and Smith's own good character and profound remorse. After deliberating for an hour, they returned a verdict that reflected this sympathy. He was guilty of the much lesser crime of manslaughter, which acknowledged that he committed the act but had no malicious forethought whatsoever. It was a verdict that seemed to align with a sense of fairness and the tragedy that occurred. Literally nobody in the community thought Francis Smith committed this act intentionally in any way whatsoever. However, The presiding judge, Lord Chief Baron Sir Archibald MacDonald, flatly refused to accept the jury's finding. But before you think he's the villain in the case here, his actions would actually save the life of Smith. He informed the jury that, under the law as it stood, there were no circumstances in the case that could reduce the crime. Their only options were to find Smith guilty or to acquit him entirely. MacDonald's reasoning was a masterclass in the inflexible legal interpretation of the era. The judge held that Smith's actions met none of the criteria for the lesser charge. There was no evidence of self-defense, as Millwood had not attacked him, and he had merely advanced down the lane without responding to a challenge. Smith's subjective belief that he was facing a ghost was legally irrelevant. The law judged the objective act, not the actor's mistaken perception. MacDonald's most devastating point, however, was what became known as the best case fallacy. MacDonald, being an educated man of the Enlightenment, didn't accept the idea that a bullet could fell a ghost. The best case fallacy meant that Smith could have only reasonably believed that it was a human prankster impersonating a ghost. Impersonating a ghost and scaring people was a minor public nuisance offense at the time, and was punishable with as little as a warning. It wasn't a felony that could have ever justified the use of such extreme force. This judicial instruction left the jury with no room to maneuver. Trapped by the law's rigid logic, they were forced to reverse their decision and return a verdict of guilty, and this was a capital offense. Francis Smith, the mild-mannered man who set out to protect his community from a phantom, was sentenced to be hanged by the neck. The trial demonstrated how the legal system of the day operated like a machine, incapable of processing the messy, irrational data of human fear and honest error. The verdict wasn't a failure of the judge, who correctly applied the law, but a failure of the law itself to accommodate the complexities of the human mind. The legally correct but morally troubling verdict immediately set other forces in motion, revealing a more complex ecosystem of justice that operated beyond the courtroom walls. And just wait for it, because our friend Lord Justice MacDonald is going to put on a true masterclass of getting the right result while working within the strict confines of the system. The public reaction to Smith's sentence was one of overwhelming sympathy. Contemporary accounts described the courtroom spectators as being deeply moved by his obvious contrition and terror at his fate. The entire country became convinced that the law was going to eliminate an innocent man, and this groundswell of public feeling had an immediate effect. Lord MacDonald, despite his rigid application of the law during the trial, was sensitive to the unique circumstances, and he decided to put the concept of justice above the law. He announced in court that he would immediately report the case to the King, George III. As any fan of this period of history knows, George III was completely mentally incapable by this point, so all royal decisions were made by his son, Prince George. This engaged a parallel justice system, the royal prerogative of mercy, an ancient power allowing the monarch to temper the strict sentences of the courts. The Crown acted with remarkable speed, and the sentence was suspended almost immediately, while the Crown figured out what to do. A few weeks later, Smith's sentence was officially commuted to 1 year of hard labor, as an acknowledgement that you can't simply get wasted and start blasting in urban areas. He was ultimately granted a full pardon and released after serving only about 6 months of his sentence. This royal intervention was a tacit admission from the highest authority in the land that the law had produced an unjust outcome. While the formal legal system was grappling with the consequences of the shooting, an informal system of social pressure was solving the original mystery. The intense publicity surrounding the trial and the tragic slaying of Thomas Millwood weighed on the conscience of the real, quote-unquote, ghost. 2 days after the shooting, a local boot and shoemaker named John Graham came forward and confessed. His motive was shockingly mundane and disproportionate to the terror he had caused. Graham explained that his apprentice had been scaring his young children with ghost stories. As a form of revenge, Graham decided to dress in a white sheet and frighten the apprentice on his way home through the churchyard. The prank was so successful that he apparently continued it for sport, becoming the infamous Hammersmith Ghost. When he surrendered to the local magistrates, they found themselves in a legal quandary. Given that his normally minor public nuisance offense had led to a tragedy, they were unsure exactly how to charge him. To bring a big case and leave the man with a fine seemed almost insulting to the legacy of Millwood, so they released him on the condition that he never impersonate a ghost again, and according to the historical record, he never did. In one final weird historical mystery arising from this case, something strange began to happen after. People began to claim to see the true spirit of Thomas Millwood in Hammersmith, and at the Black Lion Inn, where his body was taken that night. This has raised the question whether John Graham, the so-called real Hammersmith ghost, was the only person dressing up and scaring people at the time. Given that the ghost sightings went on for years after, I have a few thoughts about this part of the Hammersmith enigma. I suspect John Graham may have continued being a public nuisance regardless of telling the authorities that he wouldn't be one. After all, his initial story is quite odd since he managed to scare his apprentice but just kept doing it anyway. Further, given that the case had become a nationwide phenomenon, I also think that some thrill seekers may have tossed on a sheet in a one-off event. As for the sightings within the Black Lion Inn itself, it seems like a mass hysteria event overlaid upon a sincere belief in ghosts. After all, if there was anyone who would be a vengeful spirit in this situation, it was Thomas Millwood, the innocent man who was walking home in his work-mandated clothing. The greatest mystery in modern British history doesn't involve complex espionage or an elaborate heist. Instead, it began with a British lord, a heavy lead pipe, and Sandra Rivet, an unfortunate nanny caught up in a dispute which she had no part in. Imagine the scene. A man who was a peer of the realm, vanishing overnight from the heart of London, leaving behind an act of horrifying evil. This was the fate of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, better known to the world and to history as Lord Lucan. He was a dashing, charismatic aristocrat, a fixture of high society, so effortlessly suave, he was reportedly considered for the role of James Bond. Yet, on the night of November 7th, 1974, that gilded image dissolved into a terrifying reality. Lucan's high social standing and the brutality of the crime instantly guaranteed the scandal's status as a global phenomenon. What followed was an intense and unsuccessful manhunt, followed by decades of rampant speculation. The mystery of Lord Lucan endures not because the facts are scarce, but because the truth remains trapped between the evidence and the tantalizing possibility of a high society conspiracy. To understand the disappearance, we must first look at the man behind it all. Richard John Bingham, who held the title of Lord Lucan, had a typical aristocratic upbringing, attending Eton College and serving briefly with the legendary Coldstream Guards. Following his military service, he became a banker in London. However, he quickly gave up this career to dedicate himself fully to high-stakes gambling. He became an early and persistent member of the exclusive group of wealthy gamblers at the Claremont Club, where his expensive tastes were well known. Despite adopting the nickname Lucky Lucan, his luck was decidedly finite, and the name became ironic. His losses were crushing, and he ran up immense gambling debts, sometimes losing amounts as high as £10,000, forcing his uncle to intervene to cover his creditors. While he continued to live the high life in both Britain and the United States for a few years, the reality of his financial insolvency eventually caught up with him. His personal life was similarly troubled. Lucan's marriage to Veronica Duncan, which began in 1963, soon became characterized as grimly unhappy. Veronica struggled with mental health issues, including anxiety and postnatal depression, following the births of their 3 children. By late 1972, the relationship had collapsed, and Lucan moved out of the family home at 46 Lower Belgrave Street. Keep that address in mind, because it's going to come up again. This separation sparked an intensely bitter and public custody battle over their children. The subsequent court ruling in 1974 proved devastating to the Earl. Despite doctors testifying that Lady Lucan was suffering from depression, the judge ultimately granted her full custody, restricting Lucan to visitation every other weekend. This total loss of control over his family, coupled with immense financial strain from his debts and the legal obligation to support his estranged family, sent him spiraling. He entered into a state of furious obsession, and slowly but surely he became a dangerous stalker. He began to spy on his wife and record their telephone conversations, fixated solely on regaining custody. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this disturbingly obsessive behavior manifested itself into a very dark plot. Lucan had convinced himself that his wife was the primary source of all his troubles. Friends admitted they had conversations with Lucan in which he explicitly expressed a desire to eliminate her. For him, removing Veronica from the chessboard was a horrific solution that he believed would allow him to get his children back and regain control of his house and finances. So he started planning, but like many plans, this one wouldn't work out quite how he imagined it. The carefully premeditated plan unraveled almost the moment it began, derailed by a routine of aristocratic household management. Lucan was waiting in the basement kitchen of 46 Lower Belgrave Street, expecting to find his wife alone, as he understood the family nanny, Sandra Rivet, had her usual night off. However, Rivet was unexpectedly covering for another employee in the household that evening, and was somewhere that other employee wouldn't have been. When Sandra went downstairs to the kitchen around 9 p.m., she encountered the Earl in the darkness, which totally made him change his course. Rivet was bludgeoned to death with a piece of lead piping wrapped in surgical tape. Sandra Rivet, a mother herself, was only 30 years old. When Lady Lucan went downstairs to investigate why the nanny hadn't brought up tea, she was ambushed at the top of the basement stairs. She was viciously attacked, but she managed to struggle free, possibly by pretending that she would turn over everything to him. Wounded and covered in blood, Lady Lucan fled frantically from the house and burst into the nearby Plumber's Arms pub around 10 that night. She was screaming for help, identifying her own husband as the assailant, and declaring that he had slain Sandra. The alarm was raised immediately. Lucan, recognizing that his catastrophic failure meant imminent exposure and arrest, began his brief flight. He first telephoned his mother, requesting that she collect the children from the house. He then drove a borrowed Ford Corsair to the home of his friends, Susan and Ian Maxwell Scott, in Uckfield, East Sussex, arriving around 1:15 that morning. During his time at the house, he composed several notes, which revealed his conflicted state of mind. He wrote 2 letters to his brother-in-law, William Shand, attempting to set up a flimsy cover story that he had surprised an intruder attacking his wife and fled in panic. Crucially, he wrote a separate note to his friend, Michael Stoop, alluding to a, quote, traumatic night of unbelievable circumstances. He asked Stoop to tell his children that Lucan had known him and cared only for them. The despairing finality of this letter suggested a man accepting his fate, overriding the attempt at a formal cover-up contained in the other letters. Unusually, the Scots waited a highly suspicious 2 days before they contacted the authorities. Lucan's car was discovered abandoned in New Haven, 16 miles from Uckfield, 2 days after the attack. Witnesses stated the car had been parked there sometime between 4 and 8 on the morning after. The time gap between his 1:15 a.m. departure from Uckfield and the car's placement has been subject to intensive speculation. The interior of the car was found stained with type AB blood, potentially consistent with a mixture of blood from both Lady Lucan and Sandra Rivet. Most damningly, investigators found the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence in the trunk. There was a piece of lead piping, identical to the weapon used in the attack, alongside a full bottle of vodka. The overwhelming forensic and testimonial evidence led to an immediate warrant for the arrest of this now disgraced member of the House of Lords. Unusually, the chief detective on the case immediately publicly expressed doubt that Lord Lucan drove the vehicle to New Haven. Instead, he suggested that an accomplice may have placed the vehicle there, for reasons which I'll get to in a moment. Despite the vanishing, legal proceedings continued. In 1975, the inquest jury, convening in Lucan's absence, formally found him guilty for his killing of Sandra. This was an event of profound gravity, marking the first time a member of the House of Lords had been convicted of such a severe crime since 1760. And as a quick aside, since I can't help myself, in that case a member of the House of Lords killed his butler in cold blood. His peers in the House of Lords, who worked with him and knew him and his family, sentenced him to death in an effort to quell the uproar and preserve aristocratic power. Lucan's disappearance immediately splintered into two dominant opposing theories. He ended himself, or there was a high society escape. Notably, there's also a bizarre fringe theory involving a framing adding further complexity, which I'll discuss briefly as well, just for completeness' sake. The strongest evidence that he voluntarily ended his own life rests on the logic of the situation and the physical trail. Lucan was exposed, financially destroyed, and facing public condemnation. Self-destruction offered a definitive escape from justice. Further, Lucan must have been aware that any trial would threaten the ongoing privilege of the ancient aristocracy. After all, this was a clear case of a powerful and influential lord who slew an innocent common woman in cold blood. The car was abandoned in New Haven, a port town, and the final letter to Stoop possessed the unmistakable tone of a farewell. His friends publicly went on record saying they believed he had taken a motorboat into the English Channel and smashed it up on the rocks, drowning in the process. Some investigators believed this as well, though no evidence was ever found to prove such a theory. There was no body, there was no smashed-up boat, there was nothing whatsoever, only the vast void of the English Channel. The possibility of escape, however, has captivated the public imagination for decades, largely fueled by Lucan's powerful circle of friends. Lucan was a privileged member of the Claremont Set, a group of wealthy and influential figures who were suspected of facilitating his flight. Police investigations quickly ran into a frustrating wall of silence, suggesting powerful figures were actively hindering the hunt. The Claremont Set included prominent figures such as casino owner John Aspinall and businessman Sir James Goldsmith, both of whom were strongly suspected of helping Lucan evade justice. The most interesting claim for Lucan's survival emerged years later, though it must be clear that this claim is an allegation at present. A woman who had worked for Aspinall claimed in 2012 that she was instructed to book flights for Lucan's two eldest children to Africa. These flights, specifically to Kenya and Gabon, occurred between 1979 and 1981. Her instructions were to facilitate arrangements for, quote, John Bingham, also known as Lord Lucan, to see his children. However, there's a weird twist here. These were arranged as safari trips by Aspinall as a kind gesture to the children of his departed friend. She never claimed that the children themselves had actually been there to see their dad. Rather, they were there to be watched. She claimed the purpose was for Lucan to secretly observe his children during safaris without their knowledge. Lord Lucan did have a history of stalking and making secret observations. So if this is true, I guess old habits die hard. This account, if true, suggests Aspinall and Goldsmith maintained prolonged, regular contact with the fugitive for at least 7 years after the attack. But as you may have noticed, I've been saying if this is true a lot. And the fact is that there's been absolutely no evidence produced to support these allegations. This belief in Lucan's exile has fueled continuous international sightings in locations ranging from Portugal to Australia to various parts of Africa. In 2020, Sandra Rivett's son, Neil Berriman, championed the assertion that Lucan was living as an elderly Buddhist monk in a commune near Brisbane, Australia. This monk was subject to some pretty intense speculation for 2 years, and for reasons that will soon become obvious, I'm not going to show his picture here. In 2022, the man agreed to cooperate with British investigators who used DNA testing to rule him out. A final, highly controversial counter-narrative suggests that Lady Lucan herself was the killer and framed her husband. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that a small amount of Lady Lucan's blood, as well as rivets, was present at the scene. Lady Lucan claimed that this was because her psychotic husband, who was lurking in the basement, tried to bludgeon her as well, a narrative that most people accept as valid. Furthermore, a medical doctor testifying at the inquest conceded that while highly unlikely, it was possible that Lady Lucan's head injuries could have been self-inflicted. This theory holds that Lord Lucan, the guy who was stalking and harassing his wife and family, took the fall for a crime committed by Lady Lucan. Personally, I don't think this theory has the air of reality at all, and I suspect it was just whipped up to sell a book or move tabloids from newsstands. As time has gone on, I think it's clear that it's more and more likely that Lord Lucan died on November 8, 1974. The British courts eventually acknowledged this as a reality, granting the family probate over his estate in 1999. He was declared officially dead in 2016, clearing the way for his son to become the 8th Earl of Lucan. You're sailing the desolate, ice-choked waters near Greenland in 1775 when, through the biting fog, a ship appears. She's weathered and weary, completely sheathed in thick, spectral white ice, yet her tattered sails still hold the wind, propelling her on an endless journey. As you approach, you realize she's entirely silent, her deck barren. When your boarding party breaks below, they find the crew of 28, not missing, but perfectly preserved, locked in the macabre stillness of their final frozen moment. They've been dead for 13 years, but the ship hasn't stopped sailing. This is the legend of the ghost ship Octavius, a story where parsing truth from fiction is the only way to get at the true history that lies within this frozen floating tomb. And as a quick programming note, for this segment, I'll first present the legend as it's usually told, and then discuss the problems with it after. The genesis of this catastrophe lay in a calculated gamble made years earlier. The Octavius, a 3-masted schooner, had departed England in late 1761, intending to complete a standard lucrative merchant voyage to the Orient. The ship successfully reached China the following year, traded its goods, and loaded new exotic cargo for the return to British markets. It was at this crucial point, when the captain, who is unnamed in most accounts, made the decision that sealed the fate of everyone aboard. The conventional route back required the arduous, time-consuming voyage around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. However, the captain noted unusually mild weather for the season and succumbed to the temptation of the legendary Northwest Passage. This shortcut, winding through the unforgiving Arctic Ocean above North America, had been the obsession of European explorers for centuries. In 1762, it remained an undiscovered and unproven delusion that had already claimed numerous ships and lives. Sailing through the Arctic ice fields was an astronomical risk, especially for a merchant vessel not specifically designed or equipped for polar exploration. The captain's choice represented a severe instance of hubris, prioritizing the distant dream of fame and a faster commercial return over the assured safety of his crew. The Octavius sailed north, attempting to round the northernmost tip of Alaska, near what is now Point Barrow. This was the last known position while the crew was alive. They entered the narrow, frigid straits, expecting glory, but instead found the crushing grip of the sea ice. The log's final entry confirmed the inevitable. By November 11th, 1762, the Octavius was irreversibly trapped. This marked the beginning of its 13-year drift across the top of the world. The crew and passengers, which included the captain's wife and young son, were lost to the Arctic labyrinth. The details of the discovery found by the Herald's boarding party are what cemented the Octavius as an enduring horror story. Below the silent, icy deck, the sailors found the entire complement of 28 individuals frozen in their cabins. The extreme cold had perfectly suspended the moment of their collective demise, creating an unsettling portrait of life instantaneously stopped. The most chilling scene, if you'll pardon the pun, was in the captain's quarters. According to the common accounts, the captain was found seated at his desk, pen poised in his frozen hand, a ghostly record keeper. Open before him lay the ship's logbook. Beside him were the bodies of his wife, as well as his young son, covered only by blankets. The mother had valiantly sacrificed every warm blanket she had in a vain effort to allow her son some quantum of comfort. Following this completely terrifying encounter, the Herald's crew promptly abandoned the Octavius. Carried by the winds and currents, the ice-laden ship disappeared into the night, never to be sighted again, thereby ensuring its permanent place in maritime lore as an unsolved mystery. But there's some problems with this story, starting with the legal context of the time, since British shipping was already highly regulated by the 18th century. When you consider the captain's fateful decision in the context of 18th century maritime law, his actions can be judged as a form of criminal negligence. A captain aboard a British merchant vessel possessed sweeping authority over his ship, crew, cargo, and route. However, this authority was intrinsically linked to a strict duty to the ship's owners and investors, who entrusted him with valuable commercial assets. The Merchant Seaman Act mandated formalized wage contracts and established the captain's obligation to maintain the agreed-upon route, largely to prevent desertion. After all, the men couldn't desert or even mutiny if they knew what they were getting into when they signed up for the trip. The Octavius captain's decision to pursue the Northwest Passage was a catastrophic deviation from his commercial mandate. He gambled the lives of 28 people and the immense value of the cargo on an unproven, highly dangerous exploratory route. By sailing into the Arctic, the captain created a massive hazard, which resulted in its total loss. But this begs the question as to whether a commercial captain could have ever convinced his crew to undertake such a dangerous mission. After all, sailors who signed up for official expeditions to find the Northwest Passage were compensated in accordance with their risk. These sailors weren't compensated for this, and would have likely refused any such order, given how absolutely insane it was. Simply put, In the 18th century, sailors would mutiny under these conditions, and any captain would have known this. This seems as good a time as any to segue into a discussion of whether this often repeated legend is fact or fiction. The central controversy in the Octavius legend lies in the nature of the key piece of physical evidence which doesn't exist: the logbook. The logbook in the 18th century world of seafaring was the official record of navigation, meteorological observations, and ship management. It was intended to provide documentary evidence for the ship's owners of every action undertaken by the captain and crew. However, the narrative of the Octavius's discovery includes a critical complication. When the Herald's boarding party seized the logbook, they found that the cold had deeply penetrated the paper. As they attempted to read beyond the open page, which provided the last quote-unquote confirmed details, they accidentally destroyed the logbook. For researchers studying maritime disasters, logs and journals are vital for reconstructing the final movements and decisions of the crew. The lack of verifiable evidence and the inherent contradictions within the logbook narrative have led to a near-unanimous historical consensus. The Octavius is apocryphal folklore. The absence of primary sources confirming the story is telling, and no British ship undertook such a mission without insurance. The Lloyd's List, which maintained detailed shipping registers, hold no record of a vessel by that name, departing or disappearing in the 1760s. And just as a quick aside here, the Lloyd's List was first published in 1734 and is now on volume 63,000. Notably, the Herald, the ship that supposedly found the Octavius, also suffers the same issue. Despite being a whaling ship which would have required significant insurance and for which a paper trail would exist, the primary sources are again completely silent. Furthermore, the story's origins post-date the supposed 1775 discovery by decades, only appearing in print around 1828. Other stories circulated around the same time, essentially telling the same story, but with less details. Many speculate that the Octavius legend was simply a way to flesh out these stories, which were floating around newspapers. After all, adding a series of compelling details makes the story much more likely to sell than a bland narrative about a ship being found. What makes the Octavius stick with me is how it blends ambition, fear, and atmosphere into what effectively amounts to horror. Even knowing it's almost certainly folklore, the imagery is so strong you can't shake it. A ship drifting for over a decade with its crew frozen mid-task feels like the perfect metaphor for human overconfidence meeting the Arctic's absolute indifference. And maybe that's why the story hits so hard. It feels like something that could have happened. Something that fits our psychology for both glory and shortcuts. It's eerie, tragic, and just grounded enough to feel uncomfortably real until you start scratching the surface. It's also further bolstered by the fact that the SS Bechimo is essentially the real 20th century version of this story, but that's a tale for another time. On a bright winter morning in 2019, an Icelandic tourist stepped out of his Dublin hotel and vanished without a trace. Jon Jonsson, a 41-year-old father of four, walked away from the Bonington Hotel on February 9th, 2019, and was never seen again. His phone, wallet, and passport were left behind in his room, turning a fun poker holiday into a completely baffling mystery that remains unsolved. Jon was a taxi driver from Iceland, described by family as a reliable, caring man and devoted father. He was engaged to his fiancée, Jana, and the couple traveled to Dublin for both leisure and competitive poker. As an avid poker player in a country where casino gambling is mostly illegal, Jon was excited to join the Dublin Poker Festival at the Bonington Hotel. He had planned to play in a 3-day tournament and then tour Ireland with Jana, a trip he had looked forward to for weeks. Nothing in his background suggested he would simply disappear. He had no history of impulsive behavior and had even recently renewed his taxi license back home, anticipating his future plans. Jan arrived in Ireland on February 8, 2019, one day ahead of his fiancée due to a passport mix-up. He spent that first night at the poker tables in the hotel. Witnesses said Jan lost a significant sum of money, several thousand euros, but didn't seem visibly upset. He drank heavily, yet remained in good spirits, socializing with other players late into the night. The next morning, Jana met Jan at the hotel around 10 a.m. and went downstairs briefly to get a coffee. In that short window of time at approximately 11:05 a.m., Jan abruptly left the hotel on foot. He took only his jacket and possibly a key card, leaving his passport, phone, wallet, and even his luggage behind in the room. Security cameras captured Jan walking calmly down Swords Road minutes later, heading north through the Whitehall district of Dublin. He was last seen on CCTV outside a nursing home adjacent to the hotel around 11:07 a.m., after which the trail went cold. In the footage, Jan appeared relaxed and unhurried, smoking a cigarette as he walked. He didn't seem to be fleeing or in a hurry to meet anyone, a fact that deepened the confusion about why he left and where he went. When he failed to return that day, Jana grew alarmed. By the next morning, with still no sign of him, she reported him missing. Jan's family flew to Dublin immediately to assist in the search, utterly perplexed at how he could vanish in a busy city. Irish authorities and volunteers launched extensive searches of the area in the days after Jan's disappearance. Police scoured CCTV from traffic and businesses, and they appealed to the public for any sightings. Over the following weeks, dozens of possible sightings and tips were investigated, but none led anywhere concrete. Notably, his bank accounts and credit cards saw no activity after he went missing, and there were no records of him leaving the country via airports or ferries. Detectives determined that all his personal effects left in the hotel suggested he intended to return, deepening this true crime mystery further. Years went by with little progress until some ominous leads emerged. In 2022 and 2023, 2 anonymous letters were delivered, one to a Dublin police station and another to a local priest. They claimed that Jan had been slain and buried in a park called Santry Domain. The letters mentioned that his remains would be found among trees near water in that park. Acting on this tip, the cops launched a major search of the park in February 2024, using cadaver dogs and dive teams to probe the park's lake and wooded areas. For a moment, hope flickered when search dogs indicated a spot of interest near the water, and parts of the ground were excavated. However, after days of effort, nothing was discovered, and the search concluded without answers. One hypothesis has pointed to an unconfirmed underworld connection as being behind his fate. This rumor suggests Jan may have crossed paths with dangerous individuals over the poker money. It was reported that the 4,000 euros he lost might have belonged to an Icelandic criminal present in Dublin, and that Jan met with this person to obtain more cash before violence broke out. An even more startling theory from early 2025 claims that he was an unintended victim of a contract killer. In this scenario, a hired hitman from Eastern Europe came to the poker tournament, targeting a different Icelandic player, but mistakenly killed Jan instead. Disturbingly, since the theory initially came forward, according to the Irish Times, multiple independent sources have come forward with similar information. As of today, Jan Jansson's fate is still unknown. His loved ones continue to push for answers, refusing to let the case be forgotten. They hold on to hope that someone, somewhere, will come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. Personally, though, I suspect that if the hitman theory is true, we're never going to have any meaningful resolution to this case. Long before Hollywood existed and before the Lumiere brothers screened their famous footage of workers leaving a factory, a French-born inventor had done something extraordinary. He'd captured the world's first moving pictures while he was working in his workshop in Leeds in England. His name was Louis-Aimé Augustin Leprince, and by the autumn of 1890, he was preparing to show his invention to the world, but he never got the chance. On September 16th of that year, Leprince stepped onto a train in Dijon, France, and vanished without a trace. His body was never found, his luggage was never recovered, and more than a century later, nobody can say for certain what happened to him. Leprince was born in Metz, France in 1841, the son of an artillery officer in the French army. His father's close friend happened to be Louis Daguerre, the man widely credited with inventing the daguerreotype photographic process. As a boy, Leprince reportedly spent time in Daguerre's studio, absorbing early lessons in chemistry and photography that would profoundly shape the entire course of his life. He went on to study painting in Paris and postgraduate chemistry at the University of Leipzig in Germany. While this may sound odd, this gave him a rare and potent combination of artistic sensibility and rigorous scientific knowledge. In the 1860s, Leprince moved to England, where he married Elizabeth Whitley, a talented artist from Leeds. Together they founded the Leeds Technical School of Art and built a reputation for their innovative work in fixing colored photographs onto metal and pottery. Their clients included Queen Victoria and Prime Minister William Gladstone. But despite this big league patronage, Leprince had financial troubles, a fact that'll be important shortly. Eventually, the family relocated to New York, where Leprince managed a group of French artists specializing in panoramic paintings. But throughout all of this, his mind was consumed by a singular obsession: capturing and reproducing motion on film. His wallet was also consumed by it as well, because those financial troubles didn't come from mismanagement, but from reinvesting every penny back into his film obsession. In January 1888, Leprince was granted an American patent for a 16-lens camera device that he intended to function as both a motion picture camera and a projector. But it was his subsequent work with a single-lens camera that proved revolutionary. On October 14, 1888, in the garden of Oakwood Grange in Roundhay in Leeds, the home of his wife's parents, Leprince used this camera to film. That work would be what's now known as the Roundhay garden scene. The short clip shows his son, his father-in-law Joseph Whitley, his mother-in-law, and a family friend walking and laughing in the garden. It lasts only roughly 2 seconds, but it's arguably the oldest surviving motion picture in existence. During that same period, Leprince also filmed his son playing an accordion, and at some point in the following months, captured footage of horse-drawn traffic crossing Leeds Bridge. Those close to him later testified that he'd successfully projected these films in his workshop, though no public demonstration ever took place. Leprince was a perfectionist, and he wouldn't show his work until he was absolutely certain it functioned flawlessly. Over the next 2 years, he continued refining his equipment, converting from paper film stock to celluloid, and improving his projector designs with the help of his assistant. By 1890, Leprince was finally ready for a public display in New York City. But then, just like that, the pioneering Frenchman disappeared. In September 1890, Leprince traveled to France following the death of his mother to visit his brother Albert in Dijon and settle family affairs. On the 16th, Albert allegedly accompanied him to the Dijon train station, where Leprince boarded an express train bound for Paris. Notably, Albert was the only person who witnessed this event, a fact that has drawn suspicion now for over a century, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Le Prince was carrying his luggage and reportedly had materials related to his patents with him, though this has never been confirmed with absolute certainty. Friends were waiting to meet him in Paris before he continued on to England and then sailed to New York for his planned demonstration. He never arrived, and when the train pulled into Paris, Le Prince wasn't on it. His friends searched for him, but there was no sign of the inventor. No fellow passenger reported seeing him aboard the train. Given that Le Prince stood roughly 6 feet 3 inches tall and wore distinctive mutton chop sideburns, he wasn't someone who blended easily into a crowd. Both the French police and Scotland Yard launched investigations, but neither turned up a single lead. No body, no belongings, no witnesses, nothing. In 1897, 7 years after his disappearance, Le Prince was officially declared dead under French law. The vacuum left by Le Prince's disappearance has been filled with speculation ever since. Several competing theories have emerged over the decades, though none of them conclusively proven. The most sensational theory points the finger at Thomas Edison. Le Prince's widow, Elizabeth, was the most vocal proponent of this idea. She believed Edison had Le Prince kidnapped and slain to eliminate a competitor. Just weeks after Le Prince vanished, Edison filed a preliminary patent application for a motion picture camera that bore a striking resemblance to Le Prince's design. By May 1891, Edison's workers publicly debuted the kinetograph, and Edison went on to claim he was the sole inventor of cinematography. He aggressively used the patent system to assert dominance over the fledgling film industry, suing competitors into submission. However, no hard evidence has ever directly connected Edison or anyone in his employ to Le Prince's disappearance. Personally, I would dismiss this hypothesis completely, since while we know that Edison was willing to crush the competition, he always did it by the letter of the law. Another theory focuses on Le Prince's brother, Albert, and this is the idea that I personally prefer. He was the last person known to have seen Le Prince alive, and there was a financial dispute between them over their mother's estate. By 1890, Le Prince had accumulated extremely significant debts working on his various projects. Albert was the executor of their mother's will, and Le Prince was owed money that Albert appeared reluctant to pay. Some historians have speculated that the dispute turned violent, and that Albert's account of waving his brother off at the station may have been fabricated. However, surviving letters between the brothers suggest a warm relationship, and Le Prince's descendants have pushed back against this theory. That said, nothing comes between a happy family relationship like money, and Albert stood to benefit massively if his brother went missing. But while I did say this is the theory I prefer, it's entirely circumstantial, and I fully admit that there's no hard evidence for it. I do find it very odd that no one on the train saw Le Prince, though, given how unusually tall he was, especially for the time. For decades, Le Prince's contributions were largely forgotten, and Thomas Edison received credit in America, while the Lumiere brothers took their share of the spoils in France. It wasn't until the 1920s that serious attention returned to Le Prince's work, and recognition has grown steadily since. In 1930, a bronze memorial plaque was unveiled at his former workshop on Woodhouse Lane in Leeds. The University of Leeds later named its Center for Cinema, Photography, and Television after him. At the end of the day, the story of Louis Le Prince is one of remarkable genius, overshadowed by enduring mystery. He created the world's first moving pictures, years ahead of the famous names that would eventually receive the credit for his pioneering work. Whatever happened on that fateful September day in 1890, this inventor of cinema left behind a transformative invention that helped change the world forever.